I am a transgender. How can you tell? Is it the makeup that I'm wearing? Is it the rainbow colored pattern on my shirt? Is it that I don't look like a typical trans person to you? What defines a transgender, and what does it mean to be one? A 2015 Urban Dictionary entry asserts that a transgender is a person usually between the ages of 9 and 18 who calls themselves a transgender person because they want attention or they think it makes them cool or special. This is a trope that's been developed by a group of people within the trans community who refer to themselves as trans medicalists or true scum. People who identify as trans medicalists hold that some sort of desire for medical intervention or medical transition is a prerequisite for being trans. That is, the more that you can look and act like the gender that you identify with, the more you're demonstrating your transness. Therefore, if you do not meet those criteria, then you are a transgender, or somebody who is identifying as trans for attention. On the other side of the trans medicalists are people who refer to themselves as too cutes. They don't believe that there are any sort of medical or pathological prerequisites to being transgender. The only thing that's really required is your gender identity, however you experience and embody it, is different than that which you were assigned at birth. One of the most interesting products of this discourse has been the trope of the transtrender and the subsequent appropriation and reclamation of that phrase by people in the trans community. My capstone, which focused on the trope of the transtrender and subsequent appropriation by people in the trans community, focuses on three main concepts. First, how the affordances of social media platforms like Instagram facilitate these kinds of subcultures and countercultures. Second, how the image event has been employed in the strategic appropriation of the hashtag transtrender. And finally, the importance of radical self-acceptance and rejection of rigid gender norms, and how the reclamation of hashtag transtrender has fostered that. Understanding the role that social media has played in the discourse between trans medicalists and too cutes is really important because social media has had an unmistakable role in the scale at which this discourse has occurred. The more voices and the more people that we can include in these kinds of discussions, the better strategies we can develop going forward to make sure that everyone feels included in their communities. Social media provides the infrastructure for sites of common identification through their different affordances. Social media affordances are essentially the symbiotic relationship between a content creator and the features of their platform of choice, which results in a expanded potential for action. Social media outlets like Instagram allow people to use features including visual media, captions, and hashtags to render pieces of their identity like gender visible to others in a creative and affirming way. Because these public platforms are accessible to such a wide variety of people, they also allow for discourse to occur surrounding activism strategies, etiquette, and other shared values. From this, the hashtag transtrender community has become a contentious subaltern group that strongly subverts many long-held beliefs about gender, even from a social constructionist perspective. Since that cited Urban Dictionary post was made in 2015, there have been around 12,000 Instagram posts using the hashtag transtrender, and over 4,000 more using affiliated tags. Hashtags are a unique affordance of social media, which allow media to be grouped and searchable by specific topics. This is how platforms create discrete sites for discourse that trans people can use to expose things like disciplinary norms that are imposed on them. At its core, the hashtag transtrender movement involves trans people on social media appropriating the visual motifs associated with transtrender. There are several key aesthetic features that trans medicalists heavily associate with those that they label as transtrenders. They include, but are not limited to, brightly colored hair, makeup, and brightly patterned clothing. In addition to queering the outward identity markers that contribute to appearance, self-identified transtrenders also appropriate the language used by trans medicalists to create a consistent visual and rhetorical culture that subverts sexist norms that invalidate gender nonconforming identities. This takes the disciplinary power and expertise away from people like medical professionals who would diagnose and treat trans people, or from cisgender people who define what it means to be a man, a woman, or something else. And it places that power firmly in the hands of trans individuals. Jack Halberstam talks about the power that is present in naming and what it means to give names or identities. In this way, trans people take that power of naming away from people who seek to define transness in a way that is contrary to their own identities. The fact of the matter is that there is no such thing as a transgender. People who say that they are trans, and they don't need to jump through any hoops or check any boxes to justify that, particularly not to cisgender people. Until recently, much of the representation of trans individuals in the media was created by a cisgender public and for a cisgender public. Despite the negative consequences that social media platforms can create for trans people, like discursive violence, doxing, and other forms of cyberbullying, the rise of digital social networks has also created new insular spaces where members of the trans community can come together to share their experiences, share resources, and provide comfort for each other. Through the affordances of digital social media platforms, trans people have been able to undertake the work of deciding how we wish to be represented to a cisgender public, and to what extent do we value practices of gatekeeping and assimilation within the trans community. The rise of digital media platforms has allowed marginalized individuals significantly more control over the narratives surrounding their identities by removing many of the barriers to self-representation. For example, I can identify myself as a trans person in social media spaces, and I'm able to take comfort in the fact that any of the cis people who may be viewing that media are seeing me through my eyes. While transgender originated on platforms like Tumblr and YouTube as a derogatory term to call out people who were bringing bad attention to the trans community, it was subsequently appropriated and reclaimed by members of the trans community who feel like the remarks are uncalled for or unjustified. People like myself, who have utilized the hashtag transgender, do so to subvert the transphobic notions of gender expression that continue to confine and constrain trans people's gender expression in the same ways that cis people do. To move beyond the role of social media in all of this, another context in which we can consider this activism strategy is what John Delacath and Michael DeLuca call an image event. Image events are an activism strategy that consists of argumentative fragments that are meant to be picked up and disseminated through media outlets. Although this strategy typically refers to public demonstrations and dissemination through press or news media, we can also see the ways in which hashtag transgender has acted as an image event through its rejection of the sense-making rules of discourse and the ways in which it flips the script on what validates a trans person. Delacath and DeLuca tell us that image events expand possibilities for public discourse by creating entirely new lines of argument. What the hashtag transgender movement has done is they've created a visual rhetoric for conveying their argument, which is that you don't need to look a certain way or be a certain way in order to be trans. They've capitalized on their aesthetics and created looks that convey that argument. Image events challenge not just the held beliefs surrounding a particular topic, but they also call out the norms of appropriateness in discourse. Oftentimes, transgenders who use their outward aesthetic and their identity markers to convey their argument are called out as not engaging in the discourse and not persuading people, not using a logical form of argumentation, which is exactly what image events are supposed to do. Image events take the norms of discourse and turn them on their head and allow something like an Instagram post with a specific hashtag to become a form of argumentation and assertive embodiment. The people who make up the hashtag transgender movement aren't existing just outside of the normal channels of discourse, but they are creating new ones to have conversations that don't bog themselves down in things like expertise and the exercise of power. Identification within the hashtag transgender movement has not just been a protest against trans medical ideology and gender policing in the trans community. It's not simply a contrarian viewpoint on transness that makes way for more attack helicopter jokes, but rather highlighting problems with dictating norms surrounding gender and policing people within your own community. In addition to creating new means of articulating gender variance and ideology, the hashtag transgender movement has also disrupted the monolithic trans narrative that was developed and legitimized by cisgender people through institutions like medical science, and reclaimed the power of naming and defining transness. Not every trans person experiences gender dysphoria. Not every trans person wants to medically transition. Some only want pieces or parts of that. And that's okay. There's no checklist that you have to follow. There are no goalposts that you have to reach in order to be a trans individual. Rather than allowing a cisgender public to define who is or isn't trans, the hashtag transgender movement has deliberately sought to put that power back in the hands of trans people. And in doing so, the movement has encouraged trans individuals to develop their own unique and personal relationship with gender. Moreover, the movement takes the prescribed labor of palatability and passing off the shoulders of trans people. The burden ought never be placed on people of marginalized identities to present themselves in a way that is consistent with or suitable for hegemonic logics of embodiment. These logics always seek to maintain power for those who are privileged and disempower those who are not. In the same ways that words like queer have been reclaimed by members of the LGBTQ+ community, hashtag transgender has quickly become a site of reclamation for trans people who do not wish to be limited by cisgender conceptions of gender identity and the interrelated power structures that it both supports and is supported by. Hashtag transgender leans into the social constructionist view of gender and instrumentalizes visual media to point out the absurdity of prescribed gender norms. In creating the spectacle and image event that is the hashtag transgender movement, participants created a means of overcoming the obstacles that people of marginalized identities often face when it comes to engaging in public discourse, including stratification of resources and expertise. As Halberstam says, massive shifts in the meaning of embodiment do not happen overnight, but rather they accrue meaning over time, incrementally, but decisively. Transmedicalist call-out culture was essentially a proposed solution to transphobia perpetuated by cisgender individuals, meant to facilitate the acceptance of trans people in society. Insofar as this proposed solution only served to demean and belittle trans people who do not neatly fit into the lines of binary genders or binary gender presentation, and also prop up problematic notions of gender identity. The way that I choose to dress, the way that I choose to present my gender is nobody else's business but mine. And at the end of the day, trans people have already been policed enough by cis people, and so to go through and enact that same policing and discipline onto other members of our own community is completely counterintuitive, which is what the hashtag transgender movement seeks to point out. They highlight the absurdity of insisting that people can't wear what they want to wear or call themselves what they want to be called. Transgenders assert that they are not a burden or an inconvenience, nor are we an embarrassment to the trans community at large. Nobody within the trans community is an embarrassment or unwelcome, other than those who serve to perpetuate transphobia and belittle others. The hashtag transgender movement illuminated the fact that trans people have internalized so much of the gender policing that's been enacted upon us. We may inflict it upon others. Rather than following the conventional pattern of assimilation, which has been constructed as not just the best means of survival for trans people, but the only means, transgenders asked why. And with such a simple question, the hashtag transgender movement created a visual queer rhetoric of radical self-acceptance that redefined how coalition building in digital queer spaces occurs. They created a new means of argumentation and did so doing what they love, wearing what they love, and acting how they want to act. I know for me, the hashtag transgender movement has made it so I can present myself as a transmasculine person however I want without having to worry about whether or not I am a legitimate trans person. I know that I am, and whatever steps I want to take next to embody my own gender identity is no one's business but mine. The label of hashtag transgender for me is not something that is derogatory or demeaning, but something that is incredibly freeing because it represents the potential to embody my gender however I want. And the networked site of communication that the appropriation of the hashtag has created allows me to find like-minded individuals and also pick up some makeup tips. As just a final note, I would like to say thank you to everybody else for their amazing capstone presentations. Thank you so much to the communications department for getting this all set up so that we can still share our work in a way that's meaningful despite the circumstances that we find ourselves under.